Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through the Writing and Language section of SAT Practice Test 5. I'll be giving you my tips, tricks, and advice on how you can move efficiently through this section, how to identify the question type you're being asked and use that to your advantage. So now let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read through each passage as I approach a question. I'm going to go ahead and read off that question. I'm going to show you how I approach the question and then ultimately show you how I arrive at my right answer. So we're going to start out with prehistoric printing. Paleontologists are using modern technology to gain a greater understanding of the distant past. With the aid of computed tomography, CT scanning, and 3D printing, researchers are able to create accurate models of prehistoric fossils. Okay, well, what I see right away, before I even look at the question, I read, create accurate models, and then I'm told these models. Well, this one here is telling me I'm probably going to be asked about whether a sentence should be added really just whether a sentence should be added. So what I'm thinking here is I see I have create accurate models in these models. I probably don't want to split those two sentences up, but I'll go ahead and read the question. And we're told at this point the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Fossils provide paleontologists with a convenient way of estimating the age of a rock in which fossils are found. Well, what we were just talking about is the printing of models of prehistoric fossils. We're not concerned about estimating the age of the rock in which the fossils are found. So we're not going to add this here. And we're not going to add it because it's not directly related to the main point of the paragraph. And now we have these models have expanded researchers' knowledge of ancient species and swear. Well, as I read through, if I see a word that's underlined and it is only one word underlined in the middle of a sentence, as I read through, I'm going to go ahead and try to think of what I would fill in for that word. Because more than likely, when you see that, it's going to be you have to substitute in a word, or no change will be also an option. But when I read that, as I approach that word, I'm going to try and fill in as if I was writing it, right? So I would say, these models have expanded researchers' knowledge of ancient species and promise to advance the field of paleontology in the years to come, right? And another way to think about it, if you say you filled in with a different word, then you're just going to run through your answer choices and see which one flows like normal, like what you would normally say to someone, and what one also works grammatically, right? So we have expand researchers' knowledge of ancient species and swear to advance the field. Well, no one really ever says that, right? That's not idiomatic. What about subscribe to advance the field? Well, that one, the definition doesn't even work. And then vow, we're not going to be talking about vows when we're talking about paleontology in a science article, right? We're going to be talking about how this researcher's knowledge of ancient species has expanded and promises to advance the field of paleontology in the years to come. CT scanners use X-rays to map the surface of a fossil in minute detail, recording as many as 1 million data points to create a digital blueprint. A 3D printer then builds a polymer model based on this blueprint, much as a regular computer printer reproduces digital documents on paper. And now we're told the writer is considering deleting the underlined sentence, should the sentence be kept or deleted. Alright, so we already know in our previous sentence, we compared a regular computer printer to our 3D printer. And now we're going to go ahead and read this sentence. We have, whereas the head of an ordinary computer printer moves back and forth while printing ink onto paper, so we're continuing with this comparison, a corresponding part of a 3D printer moves in multiple dimensions while squirting out thin layers of melted polymer plastic. Okay, well, should the sentence be kept or deleted? I'm going to keep reading. I want to get that next sentence too, just so I make sure I have a better understanding of the passage. The plastic hardens quickly. It allows the printer to build the layers of the final model. Well, what we can see is that this sentence that follows actually really needs our explanation back here, because we're talking about how this plastic polymer is melted, right? Well, that wouldn't make sense to just go from digital documents on paper to the plastic hardens quickly. So we need this to be kept, right? It provides details to illustrate how a 3D printer works. That's why. Now we move on. We have question 4. The plastic hardens quickly. And then we have it. Well, if we have the plastic hardens quickly with a comma after it, generally when we see something like that, we're looking for, if it's a person, right, say it's a person at the end, we're looking for a comma in who. If it's like an object, looking for like a comma in which. Or if it's like a description of something, we'd use which, right? And if we have some sort of a date, be like when, right? So right here, what we see is we have the plastic hardens quickly, so we have a process. Well, this is the process which allows the printer to build the layers of the final model. right? So our answer there is going to be which. And another thing to know is that when we have the plastic hardens quickly, that is our independent clause, which I'm going to put as ID, and then which is going to be our relative pronoun. And that relative pronoun connects to our relative clause all the way from which to the end of our sentence, right? And that relative clause explains that the process where the plastic hardens quickly, which is all represented as which, is what allows the printer to build the layers of the final model. So now we move on to question 5. And we got to finish this out. So we have compared with older ways of modeling fossils, scanning and printing in this new way is extremely versatile. Okay, so now we see we have a 1 here, which means that we're going to be asked about where a sentence needs to be placed. We see that in 7. So we're going to go ahead and read that first. So we have to make this paragraph most logical, sentence 2 should be placed where? So first thing we do is we find sentence 2. And we have, but now 3D scale models can be rearranged with ease, which is a huge boon, which means advantage basically, to scientists. Well, what do I see? I see I have but. So I'm looking for a contrast, right? I'm looking for a transition from one thing to the next, a contrast, right? So now I read through and I see where to make sense as I go through and answer other questions. So I have one significant benefit of 3D printing technology is its ability to create scale reproductions of fossils. And now I skip 2, or I can read it and just check if it makes sense, but it won't. But now 3D scale models can be rearranged with ease, which is a huge advantage to scientists. And see how I took boon out, which is a more difficult word, and I put in advantage because it's more common. You don't have to, it's your call. And then 3, we have a team led by Drexel University professor Kenneth Lacovara is making models of dinosaur bones 1/10 the bone's original sizes in order to learn how they fit together when the animals were alive. Well, 5, I can go ahead and hit no change, right? Because I read through it, it all made sense. It was efficient in its word choice, it wasn't repetitive or redundant, right? The phrase is in the middle of the sentence, so I'm just checking that it makes sense and that there aren't any better alternatives. If I look at my alternatives, I have so to learn, which is not efficient and it's not idiomatic. Idiomatic meaning that it sounds like what we would normally say in the English language. So that one is learning, right? That's not efficient with our words. In order for learning, that's not grammatically correct either. So our answer there is going to be A. Then we have sentence 4. In the past, such research was limited by the weight and bulk of the fossils as well as its. Well, no, we can't have its because we're talking about fossils. Fossils is plural, right? Well, we're talking about the fossils, their preciousness and fragility. So that means we're going to have their, right? Because we need to have plural and it has to be possessive because it's the fossils, it's their preciousness and fragility. So we're going to use their. Sentence 5 says, in many cases, scientists had to rearrange bones virtually using artist rendering. Well, now we have to place sentence 2. Well, if we look at our last 2 sentences, they're both talking about how in the past, research was limited by the weight and bulk of fossils as well as their fragility, and in many cases, scientists had to rearrange bones virtually, right? Well, we look at that, we're talking about the past. Well, now we're talking about but now, right? But the thing is, we don't put it before 5, because in 5, we're talking about how scientists had to rearrange bones virtually using artist rendering, but now we can make 3D scale models. So we're going to come after sentence 5. Now we have, because CT scanners can map objects that are impossible to excavate, CT scanning and 3D printing can also be used to reproduce fossils that scientists cannot observe firsthand. Now we have the beginning of a sentence with a comma right after what's underlined, so we know we're looking at a transition word, right? So it could be, for example, however, there's a lot of options, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to pay attention to what comes before and then what our sentence actually says. And then we're going to use that information to solve for the best transition we can use. So in our first sentence before it, we're told that CT scanning and 3D printing can be used to reproduce fossils that scientists cannot observe firsthand. Then we are told that researchers from the National Museum of Brazil, and this right here is going to be relied, right, because it's going to be past tense, right? So we have researchers from the National Museum of Brazil relied on this technique to study a fossilized skeleton that was discovered protruding from a rock at an old Sao Paulo railroad site. The fossil was too delicate to be removed from the rock, right? So what we see when we go back up, We're looking for our transition. Well, what did our transition just describe? It described an example where researchers from the National Museum of Brazil relied on this technique. That's an example, so we're going to use for example. So our answer there is going to be D. Now we have question 10, which asks us which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences. Well, let's take a look. So we're looking to combine them. We have the fossil is too delicate to be removed from the rock because of the fossil's delicate nature. Those two say the same thing, so one of them has to go because they're both talking about the fossil's delicate nature, right? And the team dug up a block of stone around the fossil and brought it to their lab. So what we do is when I see that I have to combine underlined sentences, I always start with my shortest answer choice first, which in this case is going to be C. It's 3 lines, the rest are 4. So we have the fossil was too delicate to be removed from the rock, so the team dug up a block of stone around the fossil and brought it to their lab. And that all works, right? It proceeds across a logical timeline. It's efficient in its word choice. It says nothing repetitive and nothing redundant, right? So if you're in a time crunch, you go ahead and hit C and you move on. If you have time, you can check the other answer choices. But what we see is we have all the information that we had in our 2 sentences here, just minus the redundancy, right? So that answer choice is perfect. So we can go and circle C. If we were to look at the other answer choices, we would see A, the fossil could not be removed from the rock on account of it being too delicate. Well, that's quite wordy, right? On account of it being too delicate. Do we need all of that just to say that the fossil was delicate and fragile? No, right? That's just way too long. It's not efficient. Now if we look at choice B, the team thought the fossil was too delicate to remove from the rock in their next decision. That's really wordy, right? We don't want to be wordy when we're writing. So our answer is not going to be B. If we look at D, in removing the fossil from the rock, the team found it was too delicate. Well, that doesn't really make sense. Then they dug up a block of stone around the fossil and brought it to their lab. That doesn't proceed across the logical timeline, right? And it's not efficient with our word choice. There's just a lot wrong with that one. C is efficient, it's not repetitive, and it eliminates any redundancy that was in the original. Now we have, with the aid of a CT scanner and a 3D printer, they were able to produce a resin model of the fossil. Examining the model, the researchers determined that we're talking about the researchers here, right? The researchers, they determined that they had found a new species, right? The researchers means it's going to be they. It's not he or she for the researchers, and it's not it, and it's not one. Thomas Nast, the crusading cartoonist. Stop them pictures. Legend has it the corrupt politician William Boss Tweed once used those words when ordering someone to offer a bribe to Thomas Nast, an artist who had become famous for cartoons that called for reforms to end corruption. All right, now we are given a transition phrase at the beginning of a sentence followed by a comma, so we're just looking for the best word to transition between our previous sentence and the sentence that we are on. So we see in our previous sentence, we talk about Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, who called for reforms to end corruption, and we see in our next sentence we have Tweed's attempt to silence the artist failed, and Nast's cartoons, published in magazines like Harper's Weekly, actually played a key role in bringing Boss Tweed and his cronies to justice. Well, there's no result there, right? There's no causation and then a result, so we can't have A. Therefore also doesn't work because there's no as a result, right? And furthermore also doesn't work, so we're not adding on. We're just stating that Boss Tweed once used those words when ordering someone to offer a bribe to him, to Thomas Nast, who had become famous for cartoons that called for reforms to end corruption, right? That's just a statement. And then following that, we just have another statement that his attempt to silence failed. So there's no transition out of our choices that makes logical sense here, so we delete the underlined portion. Now we have question 13, which asks for which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences. Whenever we have a effectively combined underlined sentences, I always recommend starting with the shortest ones first. So we see D has 3 lines, the rest have 4, so we're going to start with D. But we start by reading our sentences. We have, there were powerful political organizations in the 1860s and 1870s. These organizations, right, that's redundant, were known as political machines and started taking control of city governments. So if we read choice D, it says, in the 1860s and the 1870s, powerful political organizations known as political machines started taking control of city governments. And that makes sense. It follows a logical order in a logical timeline. So we know that'll be our answer because there's nothing wrong with it. It's all flows logically, it's grammatically correct. But if we look at our other choices just to double check, and we just go down the line to double check, answer choice A says powerful political organizations in the 1860s and the 1870s started taking control of city governments, and they were known as political machines. What we see "and they were known as," and that's really inefficient, right? That's not a good way to say that. It's inefficient with our words. We don't want to be inefficient. A's out. If we look at B, we have known as political machines in the 1860s and 1870s, political organizations. See, that one doesn't work either. We don't want to start a sentence with known as political machines, right? That's just a terrible way to start a sentence. Not to mention the fact that this is kind of redundant, just going all the way, not redundant, but it's just very, very inefficient throughout the entire sentence here, right? We don't want to have that. We want to be efficient, direct, and to the point, while still touching on every point we need to. If we look at C, we have city governments were taken control of in the 1860s and 1870s, and powerful political organizations known as political machines did so. I mean, just look at how inefficient that is. We have did so as a way to end our sentence, right? We want to be more sophisticated with our writing than saying did so, right? So C is going to be out, and D is going to be our answer. It's to the point, clear, and efficient with word choice. No repetition or redundancy there. And then we have these political machines were able to pack legislatures and courts with hand-picked supporters by purchasing votes, comma, a form of election fraud involving the exchange of money or favors for votes. Well, looking at this, anytime that you see a comma after something, and then we are giving an explanation of that thing, right? That works. We don't have to have a semicolon. We can just use a comma. We're just explaining the idea that preceded that comma, right? So we just go ahead and start with A right there. But that's not, if we look at our other options, we have by purchasing votes being a form of election fraud. No, we don't have to have, no, we don't have to have being before that, right? When we have that comma, this right here is just explaining votes, right? It's an A positive explaining the purchasing of votes. So we don't need to have being there, we don't have to have that is, and we don't have to have which it is. We can just go straight into it after the comma with a form of election fraud and then explaining it. So our answer there is going to be A. Now we have once a political machine had control of enough important positions, its members were able to use public funds to enrich themselves and their friends. Ball's, Tweed's, Tammany Hall Group, and then we have a comma here, which controlled New York City in the 1860s. Well, we can't offset this non-essential clause. I'm going to put NE for non-essential. So non-essential. We can't offset one side with a comma and the other with an M dash, right? That doesn't work. If we're going to offset that first side before that which with a comma, we also have to end it with a comma right there. So we're looking for one that rolls through with comma at the end, right? So the only ones with comma at the end are B and C. We see C has a comma after city, which is unnecessary. So we can go ahead and circle B as our answer. All right, and then we have the Tammany Hall Group stole more than $30 million, the equivalent of more than $365 million today. Now we're told the writer is considering deleting the underlined sentence. So you have to decide if it should be kept or deleted. It says Tweed had been elected to a single 2-year term in Congress in 1852. Well, we're not going to put that there, right? So we're actually going to take it out. We're going to delete it because it's not relevant to what we're talking about at that point. At that point, we're talking about the Tammany Hall Group, right? We're talking about how they stole the equivalent of more than $365 million today. We're talking about how they were buying votes. So we know it's going to be deleted, not because it undermines the main claim, but because it blurs the focus of the paragraph by introducing loosely related information. Tammany Hall was so powerful and corrupt that the New York Times, well, we don't need a comma here, right? If we're just saying that the New York Times, we don't need a comma. That's unnecessary. So we can get rid of no change, and we can go ahead and get rid of B, because we don't need a comma after corrupt either. But what we do need a comma before is our quote, right? We know that. So we know we need a comma after commented. So we can go ahead and get rid of D. So we're left with C, and we could just know that's our answer from doing that and just working with the grammar. But now if we want to double check it, we would have Tammany Hall was so powerful and corrupt that the New York Times commented, right? There's no unnecessary commas anywhere, and we have the comma we need at the end before our quotation marks. C is our answer. There's absolutely nothing in the city which is beyond the reach of the insatiable gang. Given the extent of Tweed's power, it is remarkable that a single cartoonist could have played such a significant role in bringing about his downfall. Nast cartoons depicted Tweed as a great big bloated thief. One of the artist's most famous images showed Tweed with a bag of money in place of his head. Alright, well, 18. Looking at our answer choices, they all include famous, but then we have commonly known and well-known, which also mean famous. That would be redundant to say it both, so we're going to have no change. So now we have showed Tweed with a bag of money in place of his head, and we are asked which choice adds the most relevant supporting information to the paragraph. So we're just going to go down our list here, because we have no way to know what they're going to say. So we have, like many other NAS cartoons, that one was published in Harper's Weekly. That's not really adding to our main point about Tammany Hall Group and about greed. And then in B we have Nast would later illustrate Tweed's escape from prison. That has not really anything to do with A, Boss Tweed's head, and B, the main point of our paragraph, which is talking about the greed of the Tammany Hall Group, right? And Boss Tweed, who was at the top of that. And then in C we have one depiction that omits his signature hat. That's just so unimportant to what we're talking about here. We're talking about corrupt political organizations in New York City. And then in D we have an image that perfectly captured Tweed's greedy nature, right? And that fits it best because it's talking about the greed of Tweed and the Tammany Hall Group that he started. So right there, our answer choice will be D. And we'll go ahead and read through the rest real quick so we can have a good idea going into our next question. Another featured Tweed leaning against a ballot box with the caption, "As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it?" These cartoons were so effective in part because many of the citizens who supported Tweed were illiterate and thus could not read the newspaper accounts of his criminal activities. NAS cartoons, though, widely exposed the public to the injustice of Tweed's political machine. NAS' campaign to bring down Tweed and the Tammany Hall gang was ultimately successful. In the elections of 1871, the public voted against one of the Tammany Hall candidates, greatly weakening Tweed's power. Eventually, Tweed and his gang were persecuted for, well, persecute is not the right word. They were prosecuted, right? Prosecuted meaning to bring forth against a court, right? They were brought to a court and tried for crimes, right? That's prosecution, right? They're being prosecuted on a number of charges. Not persecuted on a number of charges. They're being prosecuted, right? So an attorney is prosecuting them on a number of charges. So our answer there is going to be D. And then we have including fraud and larceny, and many of them were sent to jail. In 1875, Tweed escaped from jail and fled to Spain, unwittingly brought. Well, we know our answer is going to be brought because we have escaped from jail and fled to Spain. Both of those are past tense, which means we have to have past tense here, which we do, because brought is past tense, right? Brings would be present, and our other two are also not past tense. Our answer is going to be A. And then brought about one final pinnacle. Well, right here we have one word, middle of a sentence, which means we're either going to no change or replace it. So here we're going to look at our answer choices to see which one makes the most sense. So brought about one final pinnacle for the power of political cartoons. Well, if we read our next sentence, we're probably going to get more of an idea about what happened. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we have a Spanish police officer recognized Tweed from one of Nast's cartoons. Consequently, Tweed was sent back to jail, and Nast was hailed as the man who toppled the great Tammany Hall machine. So we see Nast's cartoon played a strong role in the capture of Tweed because a Spanish police officer recognized him. So we see that as not a pinnacle because we know what happened. We know it was a triumph for the political cartoons, right? It's a win for them because they got Tweed once again. So that's going to be triumph, which means our answer there will be B. Rethinking crowdfunding in the arts. Crowdfunding is a popular way to raise money using the internet. The process sounds simple. An artist, entrepreneur, or other innovator takes his or her ideas straight to the public via a crowdfunding website. The innovator creates a video about the project and offers, in exchange for donations, a series of perks from acknowledgement on a social media site to a small piece of art. Many crowdfunding programs are all or nothing. In other words, the innovator must garner 100% funding for the project, or the money is refunded to the donors. At its best, well, we see that it is referring to crowdfunding, right? So at crowdfunding's best, and we also know that because it says the system, right? The system being crowdfunding. So at crowdfunding's best, well, if we have crowdfunding's best, we know that it has to be possessive, right? So crowdfunding's best, it's a singular and possessive is what we're looking for in our pronoun, because that's what crowdfunding's is, right? So we need singular and possessive. Our singular and possessive is going to be its, right? It's not going to be our it's down here because that is it is. It's not going to be this either, right? Our singular and possessive pronoun is its, so our answer is going to be B. The homepage of one leading crowdfunding website features a project to manufacture pinhole cameras on a 3D printer. Now I see I have a period right here, so I know I'm probably going to combine these sentences, but I'm going to just check. Question 24 says which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences. So we read them, then we go shortest sentence to largest sentence to see if we can find our answer. So we have the idea is obviously very attractive. An obscure method of photography may be made available to many with little expense. All right, well, looking at my answer choices, I see B is the shortest, so I'll start with that one. So we have the idea is obviously very attractive. So we're starting with our claim, and then we are using a colon. So we must be explaining or illustrating right after that colon. Explaining or illustrating our claim, right? So we have an obscure method of photography may be made available to many at little expense. Well, that's supporting our claim, and it's illustrating and explaining how. So a colon's fair use there. So that one works grammatically and it fits. It's efficient, it's not repetitive, it's not redundant. So that one could certainly be our answer, and I would go ahead and pick that if I'm crunched on time. If not, I go ahead and check my other answers just to be absolutely certain. I look at A. We have with the idea being obviously very attractive. That's inefficient in our word choice, right? So we can go ahead and get rid of that. We don't want to say with the idea, right? That's just not efficient at all. And then if we look at choice C, we have an obscure method of photography may be made available to many at little expense, and the idea is obviously very attractive. Well, that's out of order, right? We want to start with our claim, which is that the idea is obviously very attractive, and then explain why. Well, why is it attractive? Because an obscure method of photography may be made available to many at little expense. So that's going to support B. And then D, we have an obscure method of photography, an idea that is obviously very attractive, may be made available to many at little expense. That one's out of order, right? What we want to say is we're trying to say that the idea is obviously very attractive because this obscure method of photography will be made available to many at little expense. We want to have that order, so our answer is going to be B. Within weeks, the project was 621% funded. In contrast, on the same page, a small Brooklyn performance venue is attempting to raise money for its current season. The venue features works of performance art showcased in a storefront window. Those who have seen the space consider it vital. However, so whenever I see that, I know I'm looking at a transition word, so I need to know a sentence before it and a sentence after it. So sentence before it saying that those who have seen it consider it vital, and then we have that group may not be large enough. Well, that's indicating contrast, in which case however is contrasting, so my answer is going to be A, no change. However, that group may not be large enough. With just 14 days to go in the fundraising period, the campaign is only 46% funded. Artists such as these Brooklyn performers find that crowdfunding exacerbates problems that already exist. Work, and then a comma after that. We don't need a comma there, so we can get rid of no change. So we have work that is easily understood and appreciated. Well, from that is easily understood and appreciated, I know that that is my restrictive clause, right? Because it's restricting the type of work, right? And I know work is my subject. So if I have my subject here and my restricted clause right next to it, I don't need to have anything between it, so I don't need that comma. So I look down, I see in D, we have work, and then a dash, that is easily understood and appreciated. Well, these two dashes indicate that this is non-essential and therefore non-restrictive, but it is restrictive. We're restricting the type of work, so we can't have D there. Now if we look at B, we have work that is easily understood and appreciated, is supported, while more complex work goes unnoticed, right? And that one right there is going to be our answer. We have our independent clause up top with work that is easily understood and appreciated is supported, and then we have that followed by our dependent clause, while more complex work goes unnoticed. We separate it with a comma, and we know that B also has to be our answer, because if we look at C, we have this comma here, right? We have work that is easily understood, comma, and appreciated. We don't need a comma there. That one's unnecessary, so just by looking at that, we get rid of C. We're left with 1, which would be B. We know B is our answer. Question 27. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Crowdfunding tends to attract contributors from a wide variety of professional fields. Well, should the writer make this addition here? No, right? And here's why. We're talking about crowdfunding, and the problems that already exist are getting made worse, right? So the problems that people in art had with raising money is just getting worse by crowdfunding. We don't really care about who is contributing in the crowdfunding, right? We don't really care about their professions. That's unnecessary and it blurs our focus. So our answer there is going to be D, right? Alright, so now we've got question 28. So we have time that could be used creating art is spent devising clever perks to draw the attention of potential contributors. In addition, so right here, we're looking for a transition from our sentence up here to the sentence that we are on. Audiences may contain many free riders, and we already know that that'll be who do not make contributions, and I'll show you that in 1 minute. So what do we know? Well, we know we're expanding on our idea in 27 about how crowdfunding is misallocating these artists' time because instead of creating art, they're devising clever perks, and then we know in our next sentence, we're also pointing out another problem with crowdfunding and how it creates free riders. So we're showcasing these problems, which means in addition is a proper transition because we are adding on to the point we made previously. Now, in question 29, we have in addition, audiences may contain free riders who do not make contributions, right? Not they did not make contributions, but who did not make contributions, right? Because what we're doing here is we are saying these free riders who did not make contributions. So we're modifying the free riders, right? We are restricting them to the ones who did not make contributions. So our answer there is going to be C. Now we have, ironically, the success of crowdfunding may weaken overall funding for the arts if people begin to feel that paying for the art loved by them, well, that's inefficient. Loved by them could be better said as they love, right? And that way we don't have to use 3 words, we only use 2. It's not going to be loved by him or her or he or she loves. It's going to be loved by, not loved by them, but they love, right? Because we're talking about people, so we know we're going to have plural, right? Because people is plural, so therefore we have to use plural they. We can't use him or her or he or she. And we also can't use loved by them because they love is much more efficient and more idiomatic, which just means sounds correct, basically. Now we see we have a sentence with a 1, so we're going to go ahead and find the sentence we're asked about, which is question 32. We're asked to make the paragraph most logical. Where should sentence 2 go? So we read sentence 2 to start and then place it as we go. So we're told, though the price for her tickets was higher than that of tickets for comparable shows, it was still affordable to most theater goers and reflected the real cost of her performance. Alright, so we're looking for where she talks about the price of her ticket. So what should come before it? Well, what should come before it is the price of her ticket, because we're told that it's higher than the tickets of comparable shows. It was still affordable to most theater goers and reflected the real cost of her performance, right? So we want this to come after the prices stated because we are told it's higher than that of tickets for comparable shows. So we're told that, now we go ahead and read. So we just start at the beginning. One innovative playwright has woven the deficiencies of the system into her crowdfunding model. We know 2 isn't going to follow that because we aren't talking about the price of the ticket, so we move to 3. She presented the total cost for producing her play on a crowdfunding site. Then she divided the total cost by the number of people she expected to attend the performance. The result of the calculation was the minimum donor price, right? So now we're getting into it. The result of the calculation, minimum donor price, and only donors who paid at least the minimum ticket price were allowed to attend the performance. So right there, we're talking about the price of her ticket, right? So we know our sentence has to come after that, so we're going to be after sentence 5. Sentence 6, by subverting the presumption that money used for her project is an altruistic donation, the playwright showed that no. We're told the playwright is female, so the playwright showed that her, not it's only one person and the person is female, so it's going to be showed that her. Our answer there is going to be C. Showed that her work has monetary value to those who enjoy it. We already answered 32, so we move down to 33. We're asked about the graphic, and we're asked for which choice offers an accurate interpretation of the data in the graph. With accurate interpretations, I just move down from A to D, find which answer is correct. So I start with A. The project category with the lowest amount of money raised was also the most successfully funded project category. So I start with the first part, and I'm going to go ahead and identify the project with the lowest amount of money raised. And I see money raised, millions of dollars, that's going to be dance. Then we were asked about the most successfully funded project category. So success rate, right here, we want the highest success rate, which is dance, so we know that A is correct. Investigative journalism, an evolving American tradition. So we see we have a 1 by our sentence, which means we're going to have a question that asks about sentence placement. We see that question is going to be question 34. So we're asked, for the sake of the logic and cohesion of the paragraph, sentence 3 should be where? So we're going to go ahead and read sentence 3 before we move on. That way we can place it as we go. So we have sentence 3 here, and we're told that newspapers, the traditional nurturing ground for investigative journalism, have been hit especially hard by the widespread availability of free news online. Okay, well, when I read have been hit especially hard by the widespread availability of free news online, that's telling me that this widespread availability of free news online is preceding our sentence 3. So now I'm going to go ahead and look back, and as I read, once I read a sentence that touches on the widespread availability of free news online, that's when I'm going to look to place sentence 3 at. So starting at the beginning, we have the recent precipitous decline of print journalism as a viable profession has exacerbated long-held concerns about the state of investigative reporting in the United States. Alright, so we're talking about a decline in print circulation, which is likely caused by the increase in availability of free news online. So we see that these newspapers have been hit especially hard, which is what we're talking about in sentence 1. So I'm already looking to place it right around here. I read sentence 2, and I read, facing lower print circulation and diminished advertising revenue, many major newspapers have reduced or eliminated investigative resources. Well, when I see that I'm talking about a decrease in print circulation, less advertising revenue. Well, that would follow our sentence talking about the widespread availability of free news online causing that. So we want sentence 3 to be between 1 and 2, which means it's going to be placed C after sentence 1. Now we go down, we read the rest of that paragraph and get to 35. So we have, to survive, investigative journalism must continue to adapt to the digital age. It is not difficult to understand why a cash-strapped, understaffed publication might feel pressure to cut teams of investigative reporters. Reporters isn't possessive, right? It's just multiple reporters. So we don't need that apostrophe there. So any answer choice with an apostrophe we can get rid of. So now we're left with B and C. Now what we see as we read, we have, it's not difficult to understand why a cash-strapped, understaffed publication might feel pressure to cut teams of investigative reporters. Well, we know that right there, that's an independent clause. And then we also know that their work is expensive and time-consuming. That's also an independent clause. So we have 2 independent clauses. We can't use a comma because that'd create a comma splice. So our answer has to be B. Now in 36, we have words right next to the beginning of our sentence or at the beginning of our sentence are underlined. So we know we're looking for either a transition if there was a comma here, but there's not. So we're looking to adjust the transition that exists right here, right? So we have taking on the public interest as a choice, but that isn't necessarily what these investigative journalists are doing, right? They're not taking on the public interest because taking on implies that they're going against or battling, right? And they aren't doing that. So we know that A is going to be out. Next, we have undertaken in the public interest, right? Well, that's true, right? The journalists are undertaken in the public interest, right? They're advocating for the public interest. C would be overtaking the public interest. They're not overtaking it, right? They're fighting for the public interest. They're undertaken in it. And D, we have taking off from the public interest. Well, if they were taking off from the public interest, that's kind of implying how they started off, which isn't really what our subject of this paragraph is. The subject of this paragraph is all about how investigative journalists are undertaken in the public interest. They're taking on the public interest and fighting for it, right? Or not fighting literally, but in a metaphorical way, right? So we have investigative journalism involves original, often long-form reporting on such topics as illegal activities, street crime, corporate wrongdoing, and political corruption. All right, well, all those 3 are examples of illegal activities, so we don't want to say that. Next, we have business scandals, but we have corporate wrongdoing, so we can't use business scandals because that's just another way of saying corporate wrongdoing. We have abuse of government power, but that's also political corruption, so we don't need that. So we know we can just delete the underlined portion. An investigative story involves one or more experienced journalists dedicating their full energy and the resources of the publisher to a piece for a prolonged period of time. Expensive legal battles may ensue. The results of this work, though costly, have helped keep those in power accountable. The exposure by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of government misconduct in the Watergate scandal resulted in the resignation of President Richard Nixon in 1974. More recently, Seymour Hersh, reporting for The New Yorker in 2004, helped publicize the mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. personnel at Abu Ghraib during the Iraq War. Now we're asked if at this point the writer should add the following sentence. Well, right off the bat, I see in 1954, but I see we went from 74 to 2004. So that's not going to be chronological, right? So we see that, so that's a red flag. So I'm not going to use red, but I'll put a flag there and write red. So that's a red flag right off the bat. Then I read Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly produced episodes of the CBS television show. But we're not really talking about television show. We're talking about print media and investigative journalists' work in print media, right? So that's another red flag, right? So now, should the writer make this addition here? I'm going to say no, right? Because A, it's out of chronological order, and B, it isn't talking about the print media like the newspapers. So we know our answer here is going to be no, we shouldn't add it because it's chronologically and substantively out of place in the paragraph. So our answer here is going to be C. Next we have, in these and other cases, exposure from reporters has served as an important blockade. Well, we know that the investigative journalism isn't serving as a blockade, right? Or scolding of malfeasance. Maybe scolding of, but certainly not a blockade, right? That's a bad word choice. So we can go ahead and get rid of A, because we're going to have to change it. Now if we look at our other options, we have an interference to. Well, the investigative journalism isn't serving as an interference to malfeasance, right? We wouldn't say that. Right? It's not serving as an interference to malfeasance. Well, what about a drag on malfeasance? Well, that's not idiomatic, right? That's not what someone would normally say, right? Idiomatic just means what you'd normally say. So we know it's not going to be that. And then we have deterrent or rebuke to. Well, does investigative journalism served as an important deterrent to malfeasance? Yes. Does it serve as a rebuke to malfeasance? Yes. So our answer there is going to be D. Well, worrisome, the decline of traditional print media could not entail the end of investigative journalism. Well, we have one word in the middle of the sentence, so we're looking to replace it or do no change. We're asked which choice most effectively suggests that the end of investigative journalism is a real possibility, but one that can be prevented. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and reread our sentence, plug in these words, and just find out which one works best. We're just going to go straight down in our answer choices. So we have, well, worrisome, the decline of traditional print media could not entail the end of investigative journalism. Well, does that suggest that the end of investigative journalism is a real possibility? Well, it says, well, worrisome, it could, right? So that does indicate that it's a real possibility. Now, what about one that could be prevented? Well, it's not necessarily saying directly that it can be prevented, but it's saying that it could or could not happen, but it's not saying there's anything we can do to prevent it, right? Anything we can do to sway the odds in one way or another. So this one right here, I'm going to put a 0 or a theta sign, just kind of saying I'm kind of neutral on that, right? So this could be the answer, but it's not too strong on that second part, right? Indicating that it's one that can be prevented. Now if we look at answer choice B, we have, well, worrisome, the decline of traditional print media need not entail the end of investigative journalism. Well, let's think about it. Does that indicate it can be prevented? It does, because it's saying it need not entail. As in, it's in our control. We can make it so it's not the end of investigative journalism. And then, does it also show that it's a real possibility? It does, because it's saying it could happen, but it doesn't need to. So our answer there is going to be B. Next we have, which choice most effectively sets up the examples in the following sentences? So we need to read our following sentences to read our examples. So we see that we have nonprofit enterprises, such as the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, have begun to fill the void created by staff losses at newspapers and magazines. Enterprising freelance reporters, newly funded by nonprofits, make extensive use of social media, right? So we see we're talking about new eras of investigative reporting, right? So we're looking for something that introduces those examples. So we have, although many newsrooms have reduced their staff, some still employ investigative reporters, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a new era outside of newsrooms. And B, we talk about investigative journalism declining in the 1930s and 50s, but being revived in the 60s. That's not even close to what we're talking about. And C, we have, according to the Pew Research Center, more people get their national and international news from the internet than from newspapers. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking specifically about investigative journalism, right? So not necessarily about news. Next we have, indeed, recent years have witnessed innovative adjustments to changing times. Well, that is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about innovation away from newspapers and into new uses of social media for investigative reporting. So our answer there is going to be D. So now we go back, we have 42. Now as I read this, I saw nonprofit enterprises, such as the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Well, I had such as here, right? So if I were going to use a comma, it would have to be here and at the end of here, right? At the end of project. But there is no comma at the end of project, so I know that I don't need one before such as. So I know that I can just read straight through and it all flows perfectly, right? So I know my answer there is going to be no change. Alright. The Help Me Investigate project, for example, solicited readers to submit tips and information related to ongoing stories to its website. Alright, well this is an example of how they're using social media and internet and the adoption of technology for investigative journalism, right? So this is an example, so our answer there is going to be A. It's not therefore, it's not contrasting with however, and it's not in any case. We're given an example of what we've been talking about. Far from marking the end of investigative journalism, cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens has been facilitated by the advent of the digital age. Well, when I read this part up top, far from marking the end of investigative journalism, I'm looking for that to lead right into whatever's next, right? So when I look at this and I see far from marking the end of investigative journalism followed by cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens, I see that's out of place, right? One doesn't introduce the other. Now if I look at B, we have the number of potential investigators has increased since the advent of the digital age owing to the facilitation of cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens. Well, first of all, that's not even going to follow what we're talking about, right? Well, it's on the same subject. The increase in potential investigators isn't owed to the facilitation of cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens. It's owed to the increase in technology. So that one will be out just on that basis, but also because this introduction we have right here doesn't apply to the number of potential investigators. Now if we have far from marking the end of investigative journalism, the advent of the digital age, that's what we're looking for. That's what our introduction here, our introductory clause, is applying it to, right? The advent of the digital age didn't end investigative journalism. In fact, it was far from that. It actually increased the number of potential investigators by facilitating cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens. So we see our answer is going to be C there because our introductory clause applies to our subject, the advent of the digital age. Thank you for watching Preeminent Test Prep. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share as we will be releasing more videos to help you prepare for the SAT.